My name is Steve. I am not the pastor of One Church. I just go here. Angie and Talia are on vacation, a much needed vacation. So we are excited for them to come back well rested. And then Angie gets to preach the rest of the year. So that'll be great. We have been in a series together called New Year's Evolution. And I'm excited to kind of continue talking about this idea. And during this series, we've been looking at our identity, where we've been, where we're going, who are we becoming. And I thought tonight it would be interesting to talk a little bit about my own journey, my own process, kind of how I've been evolving, my own faith journey. But before we dive into that, just curious, are there any other iPhone users out there? Okay, can we talk for a second? Y'all like blue text more than green text, right? Do you know what I'm talking about? I see some heads nodding. For those of you who don't know, on an iPhone, if you send a message to another iPhone, your text is in blue. If you send a message to, say, an Android or a BlackBerry, I don't know, it's in green, all right? And I don't know what it is. I just feel a little bit better about the blue text. I feel a little more connected to that person. My friend David had an iPhone, blue text, and then one day, green text. I'm like, David, what'd you do? Text back, LOL, I got a pixel. And I'm like, LOL, you're dead to me. Not really. And it's not that big of a deal. Like, obviously, I'm just making a joke about it. Like, it's amazing. We can send photos and videos to people across the world. Like, my brother was in New Zealand, and he's sending me photos of the most beautiful places on earth. And I'm like, but why isn't it blue? So it really doesn't matter. But it's interesting how we divide ourselves into these tribes, these groups, these identities, based on what kind of cell phone we use, based on what sports we like to watch. Based on restaurants that we like. We love to categorize and label and put ourselves and to put other people into these slots and positions. And we do this in so many different ways. And then there's some more significant ways that will happen, right? Like you think about your family identity, for example, or you think about your national identity, where you're a citizen of. And then there is religion. And for many of us, religion is one of the things that runs the deepest. It's one of our most significant identities until maybe we're on the other side of that religion, right? And see, that's the thing. For me to switch from an Apple to an Android, it really isn't a big deal. However, when we find ourselves outside our religious identity for reasons maybe within our control, maybe without of our control, that can feel like a huge loss and can leave us kind of tail spinning, going, okay, well, wait, who am I then? Is what they say true? Am I really outside of this identity? And so when it comes to Christianity, like, what are the rules of membership? For like the average mega church, say, if we were to go to them and say, hey, who's in and who's out? What do you think they might say? And you can just shout it out to me. Accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. Great. What else would they say? Trinitarians. Yeah, you have to hold a particular view about the Trinity. Can't worship Mary. Yeah. Anything else? Of course you're a Republican. Yeah, they hand you your Republican ID card at the door. Yeah, what else might they say? Who's in and who's out? You got to tithe. Okay, so there's certain things you got to do.
I don't understand the question.
That's all right. I'll be answering it kind of as we go, so don't worry. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, my personal experience has been if you're homosexual, you're not invited.
Yeah, if you're part of the LGBTQ community, you're out. Oh, yeah. Awesome. Yeah, so we have all of these different kind of rules in place that most people would say, hey, this is what it means to be in or out of Christianity. You have to hold, and most of the things we have said revolve around what? Belief, right? And belief's an interesting thing because it's an idea that you hold in your brain. And they're like, you have to hold the right idea in your brain, and that is how you're in. It's kind of weird when you take a step back from it. And this isn't actually how Christians have always been known. If you go back and look at early Christianity, early Christians were known for the way that they were in the world, their way of being in the world. That was what was radical about them. Yes, their beliefs did cause some controversy, but the most controversial thing they did was how they lived their lives. There's a guy named Justin Martyr who is a 2nd century Christian defender, and he said this: "We who formerly valued above all things the acquisition of wealth and possession now bring what we have into a common stock and communicate to everyone in need. We who hated and destroyed one another and on account of their different manners would not live with men of a different tribe, now, since the coming of Christ, live familiarly with them and pray for our enemies." This is what they were known for. And this is what people were mad at them about. They're like, you're too generous. You're too inclusive. You love people too much. Man, wouldn't that be great if we could say that about churches today? You're too generous, too inclusive. This is what the early church was known for. And then eventually we start getting to these creeds and these statements of belief. And they're all these things about ideas that you hold in your head and very little or nothing about how you live and how you be in the world. And the thing about beliefs, right, is that they're always shifting. We can see that even if we go back through history. See, if we were Christians 200 years ago, living in America, we would have been taught by our families and our pastors, if we were white Christians, we would be taught that owning other people was okay. Not only was it okay, God ordained it. Here are the Bible verses to prove it. Now we go back 60, 70 years ago, we would have been excused for vilifying Jewish people. Then we had the Bible verses to prove it. In fact, it took a Holocaust for people to wake up to how destructive those beliefs and teachings were. And even now today, for LGBTQ people in the church says, nope, not allowed, and ignores the enormous suffering that is being had by people at the hands of the church. So our beliefs shift. We go, oh, of course we don't believe in owning slaves anymore, but we once did. Of course we don't hate Jewish people, but we once did. And to this day, we still see beliefs that are sometimes harmful in life. So our beliefs shift, right? And so we shouldn't be too attached to belief, I think. But then we start getting this down to some of the more foundational beliefs, right? Maybe you have started asking questions like, wait, does God really exist? What is this Bible exactly? How do I read it? How can I trust it? And those are the kinds of questions that will land you in a lot of hot water in a lot of places. So once you start asking those questions, then, are you out? Are you in or are you out? What I want to propose to us tonight is that Jesus offers us a different way of understanding, of engaging with this question of who's in or who's out. So we are going to look through 5 or 6 Bible passages. This talk is an hour and a half long. Just kidding. It'll be a quick run through. And I want to start by looking at Matthew 21. And here's kind of the setup, all right? Some religious teachers have come to Jesus and they've tried to trap him with this question, which they were always trying to do. I find very comical. They were always going to Jesus and they were like, what weighs more, a pound of feathers or a pound of gold? They didn't ask that question, but it was stuff like that where they were trying to trip him up intellectually and he never falls for it. And they just always retreat and are like, well, now what are we going to do? So anyways, they just done this thing where they tried to trap Jesus with a question, and then Jesus responds with a question of his own. And he says this, what do you think about this? A man with 2 sons told the older boy, son, go out and work in the vineyard today. The son answered, no, I won't go. But later he changed his mind and went anyway. Then the father told the other son, you go. And he said, yes, sir, I will. But he didn't go. Which of the 2 obeyed his father? Jesus asked this question because these religious leaders were really good at belief. They knew all the right things. They had all the right head knowledge. and yet they weren't living in the way that God had commanded them to. And he goes on to absolutely roast these guys. He's like, listen, there are going to be tax collectors and prostitutes in heaven before you because they have heard what I have to say and they have followed in the way. Interesting. Very interesting. All right, we're going to move on to Matthew 7. Now, Matthew 7, this is part of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' longest sermon in the Bible. It's where we get the Beatitudes. If you've ever heard like, blessed are the poor, blessed are the peacemakers, that sort of thing. That's all part of the Sermon on the Mount. We're not covering these verses, but immediately before these verses that we're going to talk about, Jesus has just gotten done saying the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And he describes the golden rule as being the summation of all of the law and all of the prophets, which I find very interesting, because what he's saying is if you read the Hebrew Bible and you don't come away with do unto others as you would have them do unto you, then you've read the thing wrong. Now, he goes on to talk about how to identify a false prophet. He says this, beware of false prophets who come disguised as harmless sheep, but are really vicious wolves. You can identify them by their fruit, that is, by the way they act. Interesting. So he's saying a false prophet, how do you identify them? Do you identify them by their doctrine? No. By their beliefs? No. By how many Bible verses they have memorized? No. He's saying, look at how they act. Look at the fruits in their lives. Paul in the book of Galatians talks about the fruit of the Spirit, where he kind of elaborates on this point of fruit, saying fruit of the Spirit is things like love, joy, peace, patience. And so Jesus claims that the identity of a good teacher versus a bad teacher is based on whether they produce love, joy, peace, patience, and these sorts of qualities. We're going to move on. There's a story of the Good Shepherd. And how many of you guys have heard the story of Good Samaritan, my bad, Good Samaritan. Some of us. Okay. So we know you've heard of like Good Samaritan Hospital. They name hospitals after this story, so you know it's important. This one's a little bit tricky for us to wrap our minds around. Here's kind of the background of the story. Actually, I'm not going to give you the background of the story. Here's what I am going to do. What I want to do is offer a modern retelling of this story. Okay? So roll with me on this. Imagine we're at a coffee shop, say Cartel. We're at Cartel because we're hipsters, all right? We're sitting at Cartel and there's like the men's Bible study is going on in the corner, all right? They're over there, praying for the heathens of Cartel or something. And in walks Jesus, because Jesus is also a hipster. And Jesus walks in, the men's Bible study sees him. They're like, oh my gosh, it's Jesus. We need to ask him something. And so like, hey, Jesus, come here. So Jesus walks over to the men's Bible study, and one of the guys in the Bible study holds up a Bible and says, what is the most important thing in here? And Jesus says, well, what do you think it is? And the guy is like remembering back. He's like, oh, what does it say? He goes, to love your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, very good. You got it. And then some other guy is like, yeah, but who's my neighbor? Because maybe he doesn't really like this idea of loving his neighbor, so he wants to know so he can get out of it potentially. I don't know what he's thinking. That's my guess, but I'm kind of cynical too, so maybe it was really genuine. Maybe he's just really stoked about it. I don't know. But he asked, who is my neighbor? And Jesus does what he often does when people ask him a direct question. He says, once upon a time. He says, once upon a time in the city of Detroit, there was a good Christian man who found himself driving in kind of a shady neighborhood when all of a sudden his car breaks down. And as he gets out to pop the hood and examine his car and see what might be wrong with it, a gang appears. A couple young guys show up and they beat the crap out of him. They take everything that he owns, his wallet, his keys, his cell phone. He had on some nice clothes. They take those too, and they run off. And it's early morning. The sun is just now starting to rise up, and another car comes driving by. It's a local megachurch pastor. The local megachurch pastor looks over, sees the guy bloody and beaten on the ground, thinks to himself, oh man, that sucks. I have a huge sermon to write today. Better keep going. And he drives off. Pretty soon, another car drives by. This one is a professor of New Testament ethics. And the professor of New Testament ethics sees the guy on the ground, and he's like, oh, this is a shady neighborhood. I do not feel safe. I wish him the best, but I don't want to stop. I don't feel comfortable. And then along comes an Iraqi Muslim man driving along. The Muslim sees the man on the side of the road, gets out of his car, pulls out his first aid kit, starts bandaging up his wounds. The guy is super weak. His car is broken down. So the Muslim does the only thing he can think of. He takes him over to a clinic and then to a hotel room where he prepays for the man's room and then disappears. And Jesus asks the men's Bible study, who was the neighbor? Like, the Muslim? He's like, great, you got it. Be like the Muslim. And then he gets up and starts walking out, and they're like, but he's the wrong religion. He's like, figure it out, bye, and walks out the door. Now, I don't know how you felt about that story. I don't know if you got a little uncomfortable when I introduced our Muslim character. I was like, wait, would Jesus really say, be like that person? In the story of the Good Samaritan, the Samaritans were hated by the Jews. They were viewed as heretics. What the Samaritans had done is they had gone and built their own temple. The Jewish temple was in the city of Jerusalem, and that's where God lived. That was where you were supposed to go to worship. And the Samaritans were like, screw that, we want our own. And they built their own. And so they were religious outsiders. They were heretics. And yet this is who Jesus chooses to draw in and say, be like this person. Without any statement about what you believe. Just be like this person. It kind of reminds me of this verse in John 4:21, because the love of God and the love of other people are always closely entwined. And this is in 1 John, chapter 4. It says, if anyone boasts, I love God, and goes right on hating his brother or sister, thinking nothing of it, he is a liar. If you won't love the person he can see, how can he love the God he can't see? The command we have from Christ is blunt. Loving God includes loving people. You've got to love both. We can't separate these two ideas. You can't claim to love God and then hate your neighbor. And sometimes that means we have to engage in hard work, because in order to love someone, you have to know someone. In order to love someone, you have to be able to listen to someone and hear someone, even when they tell you hard things. Even when you think you might be acting in a loving way, they may tell you otherwise, and you may have to adjust how you're interacting with them. This verse also brings to mind Matthew 25. I don't have a slide for it, but in Matthew 25, Jesus is giving this kind of apocalyptic analogy, if you will, about goats and sheep. And so what happens is he says, all right, there's sheep and there's goats. We divide them into two groups, all right? And one of them are basically going into eternal paradise, the other one into the bad place, all right? And how does he divide them up? What is the criteria Jesus uses to determine who is in which group? It isn't, well, this group prayed more, and this group didn't. It's not anything like that. It doesn't have anything to do with doctrine or anything like that. He says, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me in. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick, you came to visit me. Was it visiting sick? I don't remember. Anyways, prison, he definitely came to visit. So He says all these scenarios happened: hungry, thirsty, prison, and you came and you met my needs. And they're like, wait a minute, when did we do that? And he goes, whenever you did it to the least of these amongst you, you did it to me. It's fascinating that the dividing criteria in this story is based on meeting the needs, loving people who are the least of these. And finally, I want to look at one more passage. This is commonly known as like the wedding passage. It's 1 Corinthians 13. And it's a shame if you only ever hear this at weddings, because this is a gorgeous chapter on love that honestly, I just wish every church would preach on this chapter forever, for all of time. We would all be better off. 1 Corinthians 13, and we're looking at some verses towards the end here. Paul writes, now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know is partial and incomplete, but then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely. 3 things will last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. I love in the beginning here, he says, now we see things imperfectly. Like this, and it's almost like this funhouse mirror type image that he offers us of like standing in front of this thing and you're like, I don't quite understand what's going on here. He goes, that's what it's like in life. That is what it's like when we talk about God or the divine. We have some ideas, we have some fragments, but we see imperfectly, we see unclearly. And perhaps one day that will become clear. But he says, in the meanwhile, right now, 3 things: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Why isn't faith the greatest? Because what Paul's essentially saying here is love is greater than faith, which is interesting. It kind of seems like what Jesus was getting at too, all those other stories. Here's what I want to offer you. If you are one of those people asking that question, as I have asked that question, am I in or am I out? If you are someone who is wrestling with big questions about God, if you are someone who has faced the terror of the unknown, the terror of losing a faith that once felt rock solid and now feels like sand in your fingers, I want you to know that that's okay. And I want to offer you the freedom that maybe that isn't even the point. That maybe the point isn't for us to acquire a bunch of knowledge in our head, but rather the point is for us to engage with one another and with this world in a way that ushers in a kingdom of love. Can we all get behind that? Man, I feel like there's so much freedom in that idea to say, hey, you don't have to get it. You don't have to nail it. You don't have to understand the Trinity, because no one understands the Trinity, all right? Instead, we can go, let's engage with the world. And I'm not saying beliefs aren't important. Don't hear me wrong here. I think beliefs are important. I think they're worth talking about. I'm just wondering if they've become a stumbling block within Christianity. And as we are in this series on New Year's evolution, this has been some of my evolution, has been wondering if I'm out and then deciding, nah, I'm in. And because I want to be a part of this project of love and this way of engaging with the world. Like, can you imagine, just dream with me for a minute, if every church in America decided for the year 2019, we are not going to talk about beliefs. We are not going to talk about doctrine. We are not going to talk about dogma. What we are going to do is we are going to go and love. We are going to invite other people to join us in love. And if someone comes up to us and says, yeah, well, what about sexual ethics or, or the nature of divinity of Jesus or whatever, like, yeah, we can talk about that later in 2020. This year, we're just inviting you, hey, we're trying to love people better. Do you want to join us in that? This year, we're saying, hey, I'm trying to be more kind and I need help. Can you help me with that? This year, we're saying we're seeking out justice for the people who have been oppressed and marginalized in our communities. We can talk about beliefs later. I mean, what would happen in this country if every church did that? I think it would be remarkable. I think it would be amazing. And what I love about this place is One Church is a church that embodies that spirit. Imperfectly, yes, but still, this is what we are striving to be. And at least for me, and I'm not authorized to speak on behalf of the church. However, for myself, I will say, this is what is exciting to me. This is where I am going. And I hope you will consider coming along with me in this journey. I want to close with just a moment of reflection. I know we kind of took some reflection time in that last song, but I think it's always good. I'm a very hectic person during the week. And so anytime someone is like, hey, Steve, slow down, I'm like, yes. So if you want to close your eyes or soften your gaze a bit, you are welcome to do that. And the band can come up now at this time as well. I want you to focus on your breath for a second. But as you do so, I want you to just imagine as you breathe in, imagine that you're breathing in the divine love. Imagine that you're inhaling the love of God, and the love of God fills you through every part of your body. As you breathe in another breath, the love of God continues to fill you and to become you. And when you exhale, I want you to imagine exhaling mercy. You breathe in God's love, and that love is a source of mercy. Mercy for yourself. Where do you need mercy today? Mercy for this world. God, this room represents a diversity of beliefs, and we celebrate that diversity. God, we come to you united not by beliefs, but rather with a desire to follow in the way of Jesus, in whatever way that looks like for us. God, would you grant us peace on that journey and greater expanding love for each other and for you. Amen.